to the urgent question. For those who wish to leave, please do so quietly. We come to the urgent question. Shadow Secretary of State, David Lammy.
Mr. Speaker, can I ask the Secretary of State to make a statement on the situation in Israel, Gaza?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me begin by reiterating our fundamental belief in Israel's right to defend itself against Hamas. The events of the 7th of October were truly horrifying. Israel has a right to restore its security and to ensure that such a horrifying event can never be repeated. We are also clear that too many civilians have been killed. Israel needs to ensure its campaign is targeted on Hamas leaders and operatives, fulfills its obligations to protect civilians, and is consistent with international humanitarian law. Mr. Speaker, no one wants to see this conflict go on for a moment longer than necessary. And that is why the United Kingdom played a leading role in securing the passage of Security Council Resolution 2720, which made clear the urgent demand for expanded humanitarian access. The resolution also called for the release of hostages and for steps towards a sustainable ceasefire, something for which the British government has consistently led calls. Britain has been pushing a number of innovative and impactful approaches, especially but not only maritime delivery to support aid for Gaza. We are focused on the bigger picture and longer-term strategic value. UK ministers are lobbying the government of Israel hard and regularly to allow more aid in and reduce the numerous constraints that are hindering many aspects of our and others' efforts to help Gazan civilians. We have appointed Mark Bryson Richardson as our representative for humanitarian affairs in the occupied Palestinian territories. Last week, Mr. Speaker, a Royal Navy vessel delivered 87 tonnes of life-saving UK and Cypriot aid into Egypt, destined for Gaza. We've also supported the United Nations World Food Programme to deliver a new humanitarian land corridor from Jordan into Gaza. 750 tonnes of life-saving food aid arrived in the first delivery, and a second convoy with 315 tonnes of critical supplies reached Gaza last week, partly funded by the United Kingdom. Nevertheless, the risk of famine is stark, and the Foreign Secretary and other ministers throughout the government is pushing the need to address this with the Israeli government. The government is urging all sides to avoid further escalation. The situation is fragile, and an escalation in violence, including on Lebanon's southern border with Israel, is not in anyone's interests. In the Red Sea, the Houthis' attacks against commercial shipping is patently unacceptable. We have already taken action to deter Houthi threats, and we won't hesitate to take further action as needed. There is no perfect formula for peace. What I can say is that Gaza should ultimately be under Palestinian control, and we support a two-state solution that guarantees security and stability for both Israeli and Palestinian people.
David Lammy.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Christmas period has not brought peace to the Middle East. No let-up to the intolerable suffering in Gaza, no end to the cruelty for hostages. Millions are displaced, desperate and hungry. Israel continues to use devastating tactics that have seen far too many innocent civilians killed, with unacceptable blocks on essential aid, nowhere safe for civilians, a growing humanitarian catastrophe, and now warnings of a deadly famine. Meanwhile, Hamas terrorists continue to hold hostages, hide among civilians, and fire rockets into Israel. This dire situation must not continue. The need for a sustained ceasefire is clear. The fighting must stop urgently. We need a humanitarian truce now, and not a short pause, but as the first step to what will stop the killing of innocents, provide urgent humanitarian relief, ward off famine, free hostages, and provide the space for a sustainable ceasefire so fighting does not restart. So, Mr. Speaker, I urge the government to do everything it can to work for a sustained ceasefire. This will also ease the growing regional tensions across the divides and avoid the catastrophe of a wider war. Those risks are rising. In Lebanon, can he tell the House what steps the government's taking to urge restraint and see the full implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1701 that would allow civilians on both sides of the border to return home? And, Mr. Speaker, in the Red Sea, the targeting of commercial ships and international trade routes that puts both civilians and military personnel in danger, all of it must stop. So I welcome the approach of the US, the UK, Germany and others to send clear warnings to those responsible. Can the government ensure that this House has the time and space to scrutinise decisions of any significance that may be required?
Minister.
Well, I thank the Shadow Foreign Secretary for what he has said and the way he has said it. He is entirely right about the plight of civilians caught up in this tragedy and the urgent requirement for humanitarian support to get in much greater numbers to Gaza. He calls for a sustained ceasefire, and the British government believes that is the right approach. That's why we put so much effort into securing agreement on United Nations Resolution 2720. He also is entirely right in saying that it's important that this conflict is contained, and from the first moment Britain has moved military assets and other equipment to try and ensure that we detect any likelihood of it going more widely. He mentions particularly what is going on in the Red Sea, and he will understand that many governments are committed to ensuring freedom of navigation and trade. We are protected in that extent by international law, and Operation Prosperity Guardian is in full swing, and HMS Diamond will join HMS Lancaster shortly.
Chair of the Select Committee, Alicia Kearns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the £2 million for additional food and also the special envoy that so many of us have been calling for? Now, Israel says that it has dismantled Hamas in the north of Gaza. What are the plans to surge aid into the area? And also, what are Israel's plans to rebuild the territory? Secondly, will my right honourable friend give consideration to my proposal for an Israel-Palestine contact group which can start the work, the hard work of a long-term peace process by kicking off track 2 negotiations?
Minister.
Well, I thank the Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee for her final comments about a contact group, which we will look at extremely carefully. I'm grateful to her for the welcome she's given to the humanitarian aid coordinator, who is working flat out on these matters, and also for what she says about the additional funding for food. The problems at the moment are not a shortfall in funding. They are getting the food and necessary humanitarian requirements inside Gaza.
We now come to SNP spokesperson, Mr. Howler. Brendan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I wish you and your staff a very happy New Year. Of course, it hasn't been a happy New Year for the 2 million desperate, terrified people trapped inside Gaza, whose 2024 brought further constant bombardment as well as the threat of famine and disease. With 50,000 injured and almost 25,000 confirmed killed, it proves that repeated pleas from this government and others for Israel to abide by international humanitarian law have been routinely ignored. Scotland's First Minister recently described what's happening in Gaza as tantamount to ethnic cleansing. And South Africa has asked the International Court of Justice to urgently declare Israel in breach of the 1948 Genocide Convention for its continued killing of Palestinians, the destruction of homes, their expulsion of people and their blockade of food, water and medical assistance. Does the UK government think that Scotland's First Minister and the government of South Africa are wrong in their assessment of the current situation? And if they are wrong, how specifically are they wrong?
Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his comments. The government respects the role of the ICJ, and we will, of course, follow what is going on with great care. We have always made it clear that it is up to the courts to determine these matters, and all parties must ensure their actions are proportionate, necessary, and minimise harm to civilians.
Andrew Percy.
Mr. Speaker, what have we learned since we last met, Mr. Speaker? We've learned that Hamas are using North Korean weapons. We've heard further examples of gender-based violence. We've heard examples of hostages being kept in cages. And we heard the testimony of released 17-year-old hostage, Agam Goldstein Almog, who recounted the sexual violence and torture against hostages who are still held. And to top it all off, just in the last few days, PA representative Jibril Rajoub, who's secretary of Fatah's Central Committee, said, "We view political Islam, foremost among it the Hamas movement, as part of our struggle and political and social fabric." Given what the Minister has said about the need for a two-state solution and Fatah, the PA's role in that, what representations is he making to the PA about the radicalised language they are using?
Minister.
Well, the government, Mr. Speaker, urges everyone to exercise restraint on the language which they use. I entirely accept the first point that he's made. Like many honourable and right honourable members, I saw the extensive reporting in the New York Times about what happened in October the 7th during the recess, and it behoves everyone to read that. In respect of the Palestinian Authority, Britain and our allies and like-minded countries are doing a great deal of work to try and secure a better arrangement for the Palestinian Authority when the fighting stops.
John McDonnell.
As the Minister, Secretary of State will know, there's a large number of children that have been killed, but there are many others who have been wounded and maimed as a result of the conflict. And we now know that the hospital facilities in Gaza are virtually collapsed. There are a number of NGOs now working, like Save Gaza's Children, to evacuate children from Gaza to ensure medical treatment, urgent medical treatment, in third countries. Could I ask the Secretary of State to ask his officials to convene a meeting of the NGOs to see what further assistance our country could give in this respect, as we did in the Ukraine situation?
Minister.
Well, I thank the right honourable gentleman for his comments. He is right about the plight of children on both sides of this conflict. We are in very close touch with the NGOs which he is citing. We are also looking carefully at what contribution a UK medical team could make. As he will know, there is an important aspect of field hospitals, both inside and outside Gaza, which could have a dramatic effect, much better too than taking people who are wounded either onto ships or to other countries. But we are looking at all these matters to try and address the precise problem which he has set out.
Tobias Ellwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This conflict clearly is escalating. There's no single power or indeed alliance that is in full control. But one thing that we should not lose control over is freedom of navigation, shipping movements in international waters. Surely a red line has already been crossed because ships have been targeted. Can you confirm what will happen if shipping is further targeted? Will we not just take out those missiles in the air, but attack the silos from which they're launched from?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, he will have seen that HMS Diamond shot down an attack drone. The first time, I think, that the Navy has been in action in that way for 30 years. He will have heard what the government has said. The government and many other countries have made it crystal clear that we will not accept the fettering of the international rights of navigation, and all those involved in trying to frustrate that should hear those words.
Senator Begum.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just today, Medical Aid for Palestinians have reported that they and the IRC's emergency medical team have been forced to withdraw and cease activities at the Al-Aqsa Hospital, the only functioning hospital in Gaza's middle area, as a result of increasing Israeli military activity around it. The dismantling of health services that we have witnessed in the north appears to be repeating in the south and middle of Gaza. Can the Minister therefore confirm whether this government's support for the continued bombing of civilians and civilian infrastructure will now apply in every conflict, or does it only apply in relation to Palestinian civilians and Palestinian hospitals?
Minister.
Well, the Honourable Lady knows very well that all parties must ensure their actions are proportionate, necessary and minimise harm to civilians. And it is in that context that we seek on all occasions to urge the Israeli government to adopt those three key criteria.
Sir Alec Shelbrooke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I ask my right honourable friend, there won't be a single person in the House today whose heart doesn't break for the death of innocent civilians, which is a consequence of any conflict. So can I ask my right honourable friend, any discussions the government's having in the wider Arab region to get Hamas to move away from its stated aims of destroying Israel, to ensure that they disarm, and therefore that would allow a basis to actually bring this fighting to an end?
Minister.
May I offer my right honourable friend my congratulations on his honour. He is right about the importance of ensuring that all pressure is put on Hamas to desist from these outrageous and horrendous proposals that make up part of its charter. And the British government, through a whole variety of different means, does everything it can to prosecute that case.
Blomfield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Saeed Zanin is a PhD student at the University of Sheffield who's been trapped in Gaza by the war. He's an extremely able student who's full scholarship from the university, and he's keen to continue his studies. The Foreign Office has been compiling lists of those who wish to leave, but it's currently limited to dual nationals and their immediate dependents. Now, I appreciate all the difficulties at the Rafah crossing, but would the Minister give consideration to extending eligibility for the Foreign Office lists to those Palestinian nationals who, like Saeed, are in the middle of courses in UK universities, or would he at least agree to meet with me to discuss the case?
Well, I think the answer is for the honourable gentleman and me to have a chat immediately after this urgent question, and we'll see what we can do to help.
Nicola Richards.
Women and girls were reported to have been raped or mutilated by Hamas in at least 7 different locations in Israel in a deliberate, systematic and premeditated way. Hostages have been reportedly subject to appalling sexual abuse as well. These are girls as young as 18 or 19, and they're still there. What assessment has my honourable friend's department made of the emerging evidence documenting Hamas-style savagery? And what conversations has he had with the Red Cross, who should be stopping at nothing to insist on accessing these hostages?
Minister.
Well, I thank her for her remarks. Our contact and heavy involvement with the Red Cross and Red Crescent is something which is happening daily. And in terms of her core remark, I want to say to her that it is the British government's endeavour to ensure that there will not be impunity for those who commit these horrendous crimes, and that no matter how long it takes, we will do everything we can to ensure that that impunity does not exist.
Steve McKay.
Thank you. The Israeli Defence Minister has set out proposals for the post-war governance of Gaza involving a multinational task force working with Palestinians to restore peace, order and normality. What's the British government's assessment of these proposals?
Minister.
Well, we greatly welcome, Mr. Speaker, all constructive proposals, and we welcome the point that he has made that when this dreadful conflict is over, Gaza must be run by Palestinians.
Will Quince.
Mr. Speaker, overcrowding, inadequate food, water, shelter and sanitation. The World Health Organization has already warned these are ideal conditions for disease to spread. So what steps is my right honourable friend taking to support partners on the ground in Gaza to help prevent the outbreak and spread of disease?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend is entirely correct. There is a huge danger that as a result of insufficient food and appalling sanitation and inadequate shelter made worse by the winter rains, that these conditions persist. And that is the reason why we are intent on trying to get the number of trucks that get into Gaza up to 500 a day, and why also we have deployed this medical team working with others to see what can be done immediately on the ground.
Richard Ford.
Mr. Speaker, the IDF chief spokesperson reflected on Saturday about the destruction of Hamas in the north of Gaza. And he did this before the IDF starts to tackle Hamas more seriously in the centre and the south. He said, "We will do this differently, based on the lessons we have learned from the fighting so far." What confidence does the Minister have that Israel will conduct its counterinsurgency operations in such a way so as to abide by international humanitarian law?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it is not for me to second-guess the tactics, the military tactics of what is going on in Gaza, but all I can say to him is to repeat the point I have made before, that all parties must ensure their actions are proportionate, necessary and minimise harm to civilians.
Kit Maltos.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, members of the Israeli government have expressed their desire that settlers should return to Gaza at some point after the conflict and away from the terrible massacre taking place in that awful conflict zone. The situation in the West Bank continues to deteriorate. In a very welcome move, the government obviously announced that it was going to bring in travel bans on violent settlers. But does the Minister agree that in order to deter this activity, which is worsening by the day, something more draconian may be needed? And would he look, please, at instituting immediate bans on trade with settlements?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, what I can tell my right honourable friend is that the first point which he makes about the importance of these matters is one that is very well understood by the government. On the second point that he makes, that is not the policy of the government, and he will be aware that we are opposed to boycotts, divestments and sanctions, and that is the position of the government.
Abdul Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The senior representatives of Israel continue to use language endorsing genocide against Palestinians. President Netanyahu said that IDF would turn Gaza into rubble, and a senior leader in the Israeli army has said that in Gaza there will be no electricity and no water, there will only be destruction. And on LBC radio last week, the Israeli ambassador advocated for the full destruction of Gaza and said there is no alternative. I wrote to the Foreign Secretary last week to ask him to condemn the genocidal words of the Israeli ambassador. He refused. So will the Minister now condemn her remarks and commit to taking the strongest possible action against her?
Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker, but what I can tell him is that in respect of the humanitarian difficulties that he has identified, we are doing everything we can to try and secure unhindered humanitarian access, and we will continue to do so.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Given that Hamas will never accept a two-state solution, does the Secretary of State agree that any two-state solution must exclude Hamas or any renamed successor from any role in the government of Gaza after this horror is all over?
Well, there is clearly, Mr. Speaker, no place for Hamas and its vile ideology and terrorist actions in any future settlement. And the two-state solution must be driven forward by people of goodwill on all sides.
Zara Sultan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, when the Israeli ambassador was told she was making, and I quote, an argument for destroying the whole of Gaza, she replied, "Do you have another solution?" Genocidal rhetoric like this has been echoed by a litany of Israeli officials and is matched by a murderous bombing campaign that has now killed more than 23,000 Palestinians, which is now why Israel faces the charge of genocide at the International Court of Justice. So will the Minister expel the Israeli ambassador for her genocidal rhetoric? Will he support the case against Israel at the International Court of Justice? And will he end his government's complicity in this atrocity by banning arms sales to Israel and demanding an immediate ceasefire?
Well, as I think she will know, we are pressing for a sustainable ceasefire as well as humanitarian pauses, and we are doing everything we can in that respect. And in respect to the wider matters she mentioned about international humanitarian law, the judgment that the Foreign Secretary made on the 12th of December on these matters still stands. There has been no additional evidence since that time to suggest otherwise.
Steve McCabe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Regarding that South African application to the International Court of Justice, our US allies have described it as meritless, counterproductive, with no basis in fact. The Irish Prime Minister also appears to have distanced himself from that. So could my right honourable friend say a bit more about his view about that application at the ICJ? And does he agree with me that using terms like genocide is actually an inversion of the truth in this context?
Minister.
Well, I do think that using inflammatory terms like that are unhelpful. I agree with him about that. And in respect of the ICJ, clearly South Africa is entirely entitled to refer this matter. Honourable and right honourable members will reach conclusions for themselves as to whether something like that at this time is helpful. And my right honourable friend, like me, will bear in mind that Israel is a state party to the Geneva Convention of 1949, so it's obliged to take action against those accused of grave breaches of international humanitarian law. And because of the nature of Israeli society, that is something which we would expect them to do were those circumstances to arise.
Civil Roberts.
Happy New Year. Over 23,000 people have died in Gaza since October, and entire communities have been razed to the ground. And while the International Court of Justice has a clear definition of genocide, there remains no legal definition of ethnic cleansing. Will his government act to ensure the definition of ethnic cleansing in law so that this legal test may be applied to the conflict?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure there will be plenty of time for these legal concepts to be questioned and advanced, but the central aim of the British government today is to try and get relief and humanitarian supplies into Gaza to help those who are trapped there and who have been eloquently described across the House this afternoon.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Too many civilians have died, too many children have died, and a sustainable ceasefire is needed urgently. There are concerns about malaria, scabies and other diseases, so as well as food and medicines, will he also prioritise fuel for hospitals and for health workers?
Minister.
Yes, there has been an increase in the amount of fuel that is getting into Gaza, but she is right that the fuel needs to be distributed, and we are looking very carefully at how we can make progress on that.
No, Sharp.
Thank you. More than 22,000 Palestinians have been killed, two-thirds of which are women and children. Our own Foreign Secretary has warned Israel that civilian deaths in Gaza are too high, and now, given a state has triggered the Genocide Convention, which is being determined by the ICJ this week, and yet Britain continues to grant weapons licences and continues to export weapons to Israel. Does the Minister agree with me that it would be reckless to continue to grant weapons licence and continue to export weapons to Israel, as this could support the potential act of a genocide and render UK government's officials as complicit under the genocide complicit in genocide under Article 25 of the Rome Statute?
Minister.
Well, the Honourable Lady will know that Britain has one of the toughest arms exports regulation regimes in the world, and clearly any new applications would be considered by that very tough regime in the normal way.
Brigg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hamas leaders have long enjoyed impunity, moving freely between Turkey, Lebanon and Qatar, financing and amassing international support for their terror activities. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that this special treatment by those nations has resulted in Hamas accruing the capabilities that led to the barbaric, evil and frankly medieval October the 7th massacre? And will he ensure that more must be done to clamp down on states that facilitate the strengthening of Hamas?
Well, my honourable friend makes a very good case. And he is right that we must make sure that in future those who manage to perpetrate the dreadful evil behind his question and remarks are not able to do so again.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Happy New Year. The Secretary of State has indicated that he's in contact with the Israeli government and expressing the government's views. Has he raised with them the prospect of widespread disease and famine amongst Palestinian people in Gaza? And if so, has he received any sympathetic response from the Israeli government that they are aware that the way that they are conducting their bombing campaign is likely to bring that about?
Well, these discussions, Mr. Speaker, are going on all the time. They are greatly assisted by the appointment by the British government of Mark Bryson Richardson, the humanitarian coordinator. Both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary, and indeed other ministers too, have been actively engaged in making the points to which he refers, so he may rest assured there isn't a lack of explanation going on from the British government in that respect.
Steve Double.
Mr. Speaker, we all want to see a sustainable ceasefire that leads to a lasting peace, but it's easy to forget that a ceasefire existed between Israel and Hamas on the 6th of October. We all know what happened the following day. So can I ask my right honourable friend if he believes that a sustainable ceasefire can ever actually be achieved while Hamas remain in place?
Minister.
Well, I think that my honourable friend will forgive me if I don't speculate on his last point, but he is right that we need to work towards a sustainable ceasefire. We need yet more urgently humanitarian pauses, because for a ceasefire you have to have both parties willing to accept it. And that is one of the reasons why Britain went to such effort to make sure that Council Resolution 2720 was secured.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Speaker, the statement we've just heard really does not measure up to the needs of the occasion. 22,000 people have already been killed, 1.9 million displaced, thousands dying in the rubble, thousands of children dying because of lack of medical care and food, people dying of starvation and thirst and hunger in the Gaza Strip at the present time. Cannot the government understand the anger around the world when they watch this in real time happening, and why so many people are very pleased that the government of South Africa has taken an initiative in going to the International Court in order to hold Israel to account for the deaths of so many wholly innocent people in Gaza? Can't the government understand that and at least support the South African process?
Minister.
Well, the policy of the government, supported, I think, by the opposition front bench, is to secure a sustainable ceasefire. And the problem with his analysis, in my view, is that it does not take adequate account of the quite appalling events that took place on October the 7th, when more Jewish people were murdered in the pogrom than at any time since the end of the Second World War.
Theresa Villiers.
Mr. Speaker, the government has said that there will be consequences if Houthi attacks on international shipping continue. What will those consequences be? When will they start? And will they include both the Houthi rebels and their Iranian backers?
Minister.
Well, my right honourable friend raises an important point. Of course, the point that she's making is separate from the conflict in Gaza, but she will have heard what the Prime Minister and the Defence Secretary, and indeed the Foreign Secretary, have said. She will have heard those remarks echoed by our allies, and I very much hope that the Houthis and others will draw the right conclusion from that.
Kalim Mahmood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member, the right honourable member, has said a number of times on the resolution 2720, but the fact is the aid from those resolutions is still not getting through. There is not sufficient even bakeries to bake the bread for those people. As members have said, the disease is rife in Palestine. So how are we at all going to support those innocent people that Hamas is using as shields, and the IDF is using also in order to attack Hamas? How are those people going to carry on having some sort of a life when so many have been killed so far and are now affected by a huge amount of disease?
Minister.
Well, he is right about the danger of diseases, which I spelt out a few moments ago to one of his honourable friends. But the absolutely critical requirement on all of this is to ensure that we focus on getting additional support in. That's why we have supported so strongly the route in from Jordan to Gaza, and why British Royal Fleet Auxiliary has been taking British and Cypriot aid from Cyprus down to Egypt.
Richard Fuller.
Mr. Speaker, recently the Israeli ambassador to the UK very candidly said there was absolutely no chance of a two-state solution. I would be interested if my honourable friend has worked out whether she was speaking independently or whether she reflected the views of the Israeli government. If the latter, doesn't that sound, Mr. Speaker, like a slap in the face of UK policy? If the former, and she was making up her own view, how could she be relied upon as a faithful conveyor of the Israeli government's message?
Minister.
Well, I think that he will have noted, Mr. Speaker, a variety of different comments that have come out of Israeli spokesmen and Israeli ministers, but it is very strongly the policy of the British government and many other governments too that we should work, when this appalling conflict is over, towards a two-state solution where both Israel and Palestine can live behind secure and safe borders.
Still a crease.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Happy New Year to you and your team. It's clear any sustainable ceasefire will have to involve an accountability mechanism for the allegations of war crimes, whether it is taking hostages, the allegations of rape, or indeed of genocide. And now that there is this case before the International Court of Justice brought by South Africa, UK residents have a right to know the approach their government is taking to this. Now, I've asked the Minister on the 11th and the 19th of December to set out what mechanism for upholding international law this government supports. So, for avoidance of doubt, will he now say that this government has a position on this court and what role it will play, and whether he believes all those parties should abide by any outcomes of it?
Minister.
Well, she is entirely right in talking about accountability mechanisms, and I think in this urgent question I've made clear twice at least that the British government is absolutely supportive of that and does not want any culture of impunity to pertain afterwards. I have spelt out what the government thinks about the reference to the International Court. We respect the role of the International Court. We are following closely what is going on. It's up to the court to determine these matters. Whether or not it is helpful to launch that challenge at this particular point is a matter upon which there will be disagreement on both sides of the House.
Tom Penn.
Speaker. Last week I visited Kafar Aza, which is for the second time. I went there 4 years ago. Since the last time I went there, a massacre has taken place. I felt it was the closest to evil that I'd personally ever been when I was at the kibbutz last week. We also met the families of some of the hostages. I know that on the ground the British Red Cross and also UN organisations are active in trying to look after the welfare of children. However, that doesn't appear to have extended to hostages. In fact, one of the hostages is only 11 months old. Could the Minister outline if the government is taking any steps to make sure that this is happening and there is a strategy to ensure the welfare of hostages?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend is right to identify the agony that is being felt by so many families and relations and loved ones of the hostages. 130 remain in Gaza. We are working very closely with more than 20 countries to help secure their release. It's probably not helpful for me to give a running commentary across the House, Mr. Speaker, but he may rest assured that we are doing everything we can to secure their early release.
Joanna Chan.
I heard what the Minister said earlier in response to my honourable friend and his own backbencher about the International Court of Justice, but I just wonder whether he's had the time to read South Africa's 84-page application, which is rather damning, and some lawyers say it's a strong application. And really, I agree with him that it's for the court to decide whether there's been a genocide and not for politicians. But if he's had time to look at South Africa's submission, does he at least agree with me that it seems prima facie Israel has committed some serious breaches of international law in Gaza for which it must be held accountable?
Minister.
Well, it is not, Mr. Speaker, for me to exercise that judgment. And the truth of the matter is I have not read all 84 pages, but I have been briefed on it. And I think it must now be left to the court to reach its determination.
Richard Graham.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the government's role in sending more aid, securing the opening of Kerem Shalom crossing, and securing UN Resolution 2720, alongside my right honourable friend's rightful focus on what we can do to help the dire situation of health and hunger in Gaza. But how confident is he that the Economic Activities Public Bodies Bill will adequately reflect widespread concern about illegal and violent Israeli activities in the occupied Palestinian territories?
Minister.
Well, I think that must wait till Wednesday, Mr. Speaker, but we do not believe that public bodies should be able to waste public money pursuing their own foreign policy, and I'm sure these points will be properly teased out on Wednesday. In respect of the very difficult humanitarian situation which he rightly describes, the inadequate shelter made worse by the winter rains that are taking place, there is a real danger of disease spreading, and that is one of the reasons why Britain has deployed this medical team to see what we can do to help with this desperate situation, particularly in Rafah, but throughout Gaza.
Richard Bowden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Israel is committing war crimes on a daily basis in Gaza. We've seen the forced displacement of Palestinians, the collective punishment of Palestinians, starvation used as a weapon, healthcare facilities and journalists targeted, and much more. South Africa, as we've heard, is now taking a legal case against Israel in the International Court of Justice. So if, as it could, that court quickly issues orders for Israel to immediately suspend its military operations, will the government uphold that by finally calling for an immediate ceasefire, as many of us have been demanding?
Well, as the honourable gentleman knows, the policy of an immediate ceasefire is not one that is shared either by the government or indeed the opposition front bench. And in respect of the work of the court, let us wait and see what they decide. He asked me a hypothetical question, and I think we should wait and see what the court says.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Speaker, and Happy New Year to you. It is now almost 100 days since Hamas committed their evil atrocities in Israel. Also, 130 hostages are still captivated by the Hamas terrorists. The International Red Cross has not had access to those hostages, the oldest of which are over 75, the youngest of which is under 1 year old. What action is my right honourable friend taking to make sure that the International Red Cross insist on seeing these hostages and looking after their health?
Well, my right honourable friend is right to focus on the appalling agony and plight of the hostages. As I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, I don't think it's helpful to rehearse across the House what precisely we are doing, but he may rest assured that we are in continuous contact with the Red Cross and that we are doing everything we possibly can, along with our allies, to try and secure their release.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The IDF claim that as many as 8,000 Hamas terrorists have been killed at the very same time as reports that Hamas are training children to take their place. With over 100 hostages still being held by Hamas, their position looks incredibly precarious. Will the Minister outline what progress can be made, how UK can ensure that these people can be released and that Israel can be in a position to begin to seek peace? And does the Minister believe that the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland has a role to play in that peacemaking?
Well, the answer to my honourable friend's final point is yes. And he set out with great eloquence the issues and problems which are faced in this appalling situation by the hostages, and he will have heard what I said to two other honourable members in that respect.
Mark Logan.
We reach a ceasefire, something needed sooner rather than later, according to many of my constituents. Two doctors in Bolton, Dr. Samir Nassif and Dr. Ibrahim Hamami, are asking what preparations are we making to prepare the ground for the post-ceasefire period by helping lead on volunteer medical practitioners going into Gaza at that time.
Well, I pay tribute to my honourable friend's work in this respect. I know how much work he has been doing with communities, particularly who are engaged in Gaza within his constituency. And I will take very careful note of the point that he has made.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and a very happy New Year to everyone. I think everybody here absolutely condemns the heinous attacks of Hamas on the 7th of October, the taking of hostages, and that we all want their safe and immediate release. But this does not excuse the brutal, indiscriminate and disproportionate violence that the IDF are perpetrating on innocent Gazan civilians. Our world must operate under a rules-based system, and that includes our allies. So given the scale of casualties, can I push the Minister into whether he and his government will support the ICC investigating potential war crimes, not to the government to come to a decision about this, but to investigate and make all evidence available to them.
Well, the Honourable Lady will have heard what I have said about impunity and any culture of impunity. And in respect of her central question, all I can really do is to reiterate the point I have already made, that the British government is insistent that all parties must ensure that their actions are proportionate, necessary, and that they take account of civilian harm.
Siobhan Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hundreds of Stroud constituents are contacting me about a ceasefire, and many understand this aim is complicated by Hamas being terrorists and their threats to repeat the rape and murder of the 7th of October. But we all want to see the protection of civilians and this conflict to end and the hostages to be released. As my right honourable friend has said, the UK and the Foreign Secretary has led calls for a sustainable ceasefire. Will he set out the conditions that are necessary for the sustainable ceasefire to be achieved?
Minister.
Well, she will have seen extensive comment on that, and she will have also followed the way in which the Security Council Resolution 2720, which Britain was effective in ensuring was agreed, developed. A sustainable ceasefire is certainly one that enables us to get relief into Gaza, and we're doing everything we can to try and achieve that objective.
Alec.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The only way this war is likely to end is if our government continues the pressure on the US and also the Arab countries play their part in applying pressure on Hamas. It's the pressure on the Israeli government and Hamas that is going to bring an end to this war. If, in the absence of exerted pressure by the US on the Israeli government and the others, can the Minister, who has got a very good track record on campaigning against genocide, certainly with me in relation to the case of the Gambia and Myanmar, look at how that case can be used to apply pressure on genocide prevention, which is the point of that ICJ case, to prevent the Israeli government from indiscriminate attacks on civilians?
Well, she may rest assured that we, together with our American allies and others, are seeking to exert the pressure on those involved in this conflict in the way that she described. But I would caution her against seeing any analogy between the Gambian-led case at the ICJ and the South African case over Israel-Gaza.
Blake Drummond.
Speaker, National Security Minister Ben-Gvir issued a call to encourage the migration of Gaza residents as a solution to the crisis. Finance Minister Smotrich has called for Palestinians to leave Gaza and make way for Israelis who can make the desert bloom. What steps is the UK government taking to ensure that Palestinians will be able to return to their home in Gaza as soon as conditions allow, in the light of these recent comments by Israeli ministers and also the Israeli ambassador to the UK, who have called for Gazans to emigrate?
Well, I'm most grateful to my honourable friend for her question. The government has made it absolutely clear that there can be no resettlement of Palestinians outside of Gaza. Those who lived in Gaza before must have the right of return, and the British government has been unequivocal on that point.
Beth Winter.
Speaker. The human suffering unfolding before our very eyes is absolutely horrific and heartbreaking. Tens of thousands of innocent Gazans losing their lives, 1.9 million displaced. And only last week, the Israeli National Security Minister talks about, and I quote, the migration of hundreds of thousands from Gaza as part of a post-war vision. So would the Minister please condemn Israel counterparts seeking to permanently displace Palestinians from their homes, confirm that members of the Israeli government are advocating breaches of international law, agree that the actions of the Israeli state do indeed contravene the Genocide Convention, and as a first step, please call for an immediate ceasefire so that we can bring an end to and treat those people who are suffering?
Well, Mr. Speaker, she will be aware of the arguments for a sustainable ceasefire, which are propagated by the government and supported by the opposition front bench. She is entirely right about the suffering And in respect of her first point, she will have heard what I have said to two of her honourable friends.
Rob Butler.
Speaker, I wholeheartedly welcome the £2 million that the UK is providing for vital food aid, and also welcome the comments from the Minister that he continues to lobby Israel to reduce barriers to aid getting into Gaza to the people who need it most. Can he reassure me and my constituents in Aylesbury that his department will continue to keep under review food aid and medical aid to Gaza, and work and redouble its efforts to work with neighbouring countries to ensure that that aid gets where it is needed most?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I can give him that assurance. He refers to the £2 million specifically, I think, which was allocated to the convoy from Jordan, but he should be aware that the contribution that Britain is making is far more extensive than that. 4 air flights into Al Arish to support that, the naval operation which I described to him, in addition to what we are seeking to do to open this new route through from Jordan.
Gavin Newland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Northern Gaza lies in ruins, and the Minister, when he was on the back benches, said in 2022 of Aleppo that it was bombed back to the Stone Age, and of indiscriminate attacks in hospitals, and of massive breaches of the rules of war and of international humanitarian law. The then Minister of State, now Home Secretary in 2020 on Syrian situation, said that nearly 300 civilians, not 23,000 civilians, have been killed in Idlib and Aleppo since 1st of January. International humanitarian law continues to be ignored, with civilian infrastructure being hit probably as a result of active targeting. The UK has condemned these flagrant violations of international law and basic human decency, and we have repeatedly pressed, including at the UN Security Council, for an immediate ceasefire. The Minister had said today that it's not for him to decide what is a war crime. So why is this government so quick, rightly, so quick to condemn Russia's war crimes, but not Israel's war crimes?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the British government and indeed the opposition stand up for international humanitarian law and condemn breaches of it whenever they take place. And that is why consistently from this dispatch box throughout these terrible days since October the 7th, we have appealed to everyone to stand by international humanitarian law and obey what it says.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And last week I've also visited the region. Is my right honourable friend aware that South Africa are geopolitically moving towards Iran and openly support Hamas? Indeed, their Foreign Secretary said that Israel doesn't even have the right to defend itself. They are in danger of becoming a terrorist proxy. Now, I can say as a former Attorney General that South Africa's case at The Hague has no legal merit whatsoever. Israel's actions are in lawful self-defence. It's a dangerous political stunt that the United States has already criticised. Does he agree that His Majesty's government should do the same as the United States and criticise South Africa's action?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the South Africans are entitled under the rules to refer this matter in the way that they have to the ICJ. But as I have repeatedly said this afternoon, there will be different views across the House of whether it is helpful to do it at this stage. And in respect of what he says about South Africa is a pluralist democracy. There are many different voices that come out of South Africa. Britain has a close and deep and abiding historic relationship with South Africa, and we give our advice to the South African government whenever we have the opportunity to do so.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister says Israeli military action should be targeted on Hamas leaders and operatives. He knows better than anyone that it's not. It disproportionately kills civilians, including children, journalists, healthcare and aid workers. What steps is the government taking to restrain Israel from breaking international law? And will he concede that ending trade with illegal settlements is, as a matter of fact and law, unrelated to boycott, divestment and sanctions?
Well, in respect of the discussions to which he refers, I can assure him that the British government holds those discussions all the time. He will know that the Prime Minister has spoken to Prime Minister Netanyahu at least 4 times. He met him in Israel towards the end of October. He's met with President Herzog, the ruler of Qatar, King Abdullah, President Sisi, Antonio Guterres, President Mahmoud Abbas and MBS from Saudi Arabia. So these arguments and these discussions are going on, and above all, we make the point that people must abide by international humanitarian law.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Israeli ambassador in London said the quiet bit out loud when she implied that the Israeli government are trying to totally destroy the Gaza Strip. So has the Foreign Secretary hauled her in to explain that this government opposes that policy, or is it the case that this government is comfortable with that position, just as they seem to have been alongside the US administration with the total and utter slaughter of innocent Palestinians over the last 3 months?
Mr. Speaker, the British government makes its views very clear at all times, and I have indeed just given him a list of all the different people the Prime Minister has been engaged with since this awful conflict started, and we make consistent and clear points, all of which are questioned in this House.
Alicia Begum.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whatever the rhetoric you still sometimes hear, I know that the Minister will agree with me that there's absolutely nowhere in this conflict that is safe for children. So further to the answers he's already given to the member for Hayes and Harlington, my friend and the member for Colchester, can I ask him to spell out how his humanitarian strategy and the aid that he is trying to get in to the area will particularly respond to the desperate needs of the children that are affected?
Well, we are trying to ensure that 500 trucks get in a day to provide the humanitarian aid which she is talking about. We're also trying to do everything we can to make sure that there is additional health and hospital capacity inside Gaza, as well as just outside, because we don't think it's sensible for people to be taken offshore, but they do need to be treated inside Gaza where possible. So in every respect, whether it is medicines, food or shelter, or the capacity to provide additional and more detailed medical help, we are doing everything we can to advance those objectives.
Richard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the death toll of Palestinians in Gaza is over 22,000, where at least a third of those deaths will be children, does the Minister still believe that the Israeli Defence Force response to the October 7th atrocities, where 1,200 Israeli citizens were murdered, remains proportionate?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I really don't think the equation which he makes between barbaric death in that way is one that stands very close scrutiny, and he will have heard what I have said consistently throughout this statement about the role that Britain is taking in order to try and improve what is a desperate situation.
Dr. Rupert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Minister accept that the longer this goes on, every time pleas are made to exercise restraint, Netanyahu doubles down so that 22,000 mostly women and child deaths, non-functioning hospitals, now becomes the norm, as are two of his ministers saying that the forcibly evicted Palestinians can resettle elsewhere, i.e. ethnic cleansing? Aren't we just green-lighting an already unpopular, already before all this, leader who cares less about pinpoint accuracy in international law, as he promised, than clinging on now as a war hero?
Well, the longevity or otherwise of the Prime Minister of Israel is a matter for the Israeli people. But on the point she makes about Palestinians being allowed to return to Gaza, she will have heard what I said, that the British government is totally opposed to any question of resettlement of Palestinians outside Gaza or the fettering of their right to return when this dreadful contest is over.
Stephen Farron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's not good enough for the government to keep calling for Israel to abide by international humanitarian law whenever there's overwhelming evidence that it is not. The government have been very clear, by contrast, that Russia has been breaching international humanitarian law in Ukraine and has called out the bombing of civilians, indeed the bombing of a children's playground. So why the double standards, and are they credible to continue?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman draws attention to the point that I have been making, which is that we are always standing up for international humanitarian law. It doesn't matter where there are breaches. We condemn breaches of international humanitarian law and seek to hold those to account who break them.
Sir Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Minister has supported a two-state solution with Gaza under Palestinian control, but the proposals tabled last week by the Israeli Defence Minister are very different to that, envisaging a subsidiary status of some kind for Palestine. How in practice does he envisage the two-state model being taken forward once the conflict ends?
Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman is entirely correct to say that there are a number of proposals which are being generated, some of which are given voice at this moment. But the critical thing is that when this dreadful conflict ceases, there will be a moment for the political track to assert itself. And what we now require to see is that that political track, when it can start, has real force and real strength and listens to the widest number of constructive voices to try and make sure that we make progress. He will remember that the progress that was made at Oslo followed the Second Intifada, and we must pray that when this dreadful conflict is over, there is an opportunity for a strong political track to assert itself at that point.
Karen Buck.
The Minister has not acknowledged that the spectre of famine is stalking Gaza. I applaud his aim to restore the pre-war level of 500 or so trucks going into Gaza to deliver humanitarian aid. But can he tell us firstly how many trucks actually went through in the last 24 hours? Is it true that trucks are waiting in some cases up to 15 days for clearance? That trucks are taken out of the convoy of aid because one item has failed the security checks? And if so, what can be done to make sure that those trucks that are queuing to deliver aid are taken through the border and reach their intended beneficiaries as quickly as possible?
Well, I thank her for her comments. I can tell her that currently around 150 trucks a day are getting in, which is, as she is indicating from a sedentary position, entirely inadequate, but we are trying to make sure that they rise to 500. While I said in my opening remarks that there is a fear of famine, it is not our assessment at the moment that famine has arrived, but there is acute starvation and hunger, and it is that we are trying to combat at this stage.
Owen Thompson.
Deputy Speaker, the Minister multiple times has referred to application of international law. But I'd like to ask, what definition of proportionate, targeted and minimising is this government applying if it considers the actions of Israel to be in compliance with all of these? And how many children are actually going to have to be killed before this government stops with the linguistic gymnastics and calls for an immediate ceasefire?
Hear, hear.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman will have heard what I have said about the importance of a sustainable ceasefire. He will have heard much the same from the official opposition. As we showed at the United Nations, we are working towards achieving a sustainable ceasefire. We want to see humanitarian pauses in the run-up to that as long and as immediate as possible, and that is a policy we will continue to pursue.
Margaret Greenwood.
Speaker. On December the 11th, I, along with other parliamentarians, heard the harrowing eyewitness account of Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitat, a British Palestinian surgeon who had recently returned from Gaza. He spoke of the desperate state of the healthcare provision there, with the lack of essential supplies, no morphine for patients after surgery, and he spoke of treating children who he believes have phosphorus burns with washing up liquid and vinegar and without painkillers. He believes that medical teams need to be allowed in, field hospitals set up, and most critically injured patients be allowed to leave Gaza. On the 7th of January, Israeli authorities denied a request by the World Health Organization to deliver urgent medical supplies to the central drugstore in Gaza City and Al-Awada Hospital. Will the government put pressure on Israel to allow the delivery of these really vital supplies, and will the government call for a permanent ceasefire?
Well, I have set out, Mr Deputy Speaker, the reasons why calling for a permanent ceasefire is not, in our opinion, the right way to proceed. We need to call, as the United Nations resolution does, for a sustainable ceasefire, and we need to address the problems which she set out so clearly in the ways that we are, which is to try and get more humanitarian supplies and support into Gaza and move towards that sustainable ceasefire, which I think everyone agrees should take place.
Mr Deputy Speaker, we know that women and children make up about 70% of the more than 22,000 people who've been killed in Gaza. That is a horrific number and should be called as such. We know that the 7th of October attacks saw women and young people bear a terrible brunt of violence which continues.
The treatment of women and children now has serious implications for their treatment, including in other places in the future. Mr Deputy Speaker, that future must mean a sustainable, peaceful two-state solution. And does the Minister recognise the particular impact on innocent women and children and the urgent need, therefore, for a ceasefire now to protect them now and in the future? And what specifically is he doing to deal with this disproportionate impact on innocent women and children on the ground?
Mr Deputy Speaker, I recognise entirely what she says about the plight of innocent women and children caught up in these horrendous circumstances. And that is why Britain is working together with its allies to try and improve the level of humanitarian access so we can help the people whom she so eloquently set out are suffering at this time.
James Murray.
Mr Deputy Speaker, the suffering in Gaza over the last 3 months has been intolerable. I've spoken with many of my constituents about how unbearable it is to see day after day innocent civilians, particularly children, being killed. We urgently need to get to a sustainable ceasefire, but beyond that, a long-term peace needs a determined international effort to deliver a two-state solution with Gaza as part of a future Palestinian state. Can the Minister tell me what discussions has the UK government had with international allies about the future of Gaza once the fighting has come to an end?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, I think he set out absolutely correctly the challenge and the requirement for all of us. And what I can tell him is that the British government at diplomatic level, political level, through ministerial engagement, not just in Israel, but throughout the Middle East, is seeking to advance precisely the objectives which he so coherently put.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I just want to return to the comments by the Israeli ambassador, where she explicitly rejected a two-state solution. Has the Minister made clear his criticism of those comments to the Israeli government? What has been the response of the Israeli Prime Minister? And does he accept that this is the policy of the Israeli government going forward? Israel will have effectively ended any possibility of long-term peace in the region.
Well, he will know, Mr Deputy Speaker, that there are many different voices coming out of Israel. It was perhaps a matter of surprise that the ambassador chose to express herself at this point in precisely that way. But he will be aware of the policy of the British government, which is to support a two-state solution. That has always been the policy. It is the policy of both front benches, and one which Britain is bending every sinew to make sure that we achieve.
Jonathan Edwards.
Mr Deputy Speaker. The Israeli government have demanded full control of the Philadelphia corridor, the land border between Gaza and Egypt. And as the Minister himself said that earlier in the debate, that's the main aid corridor for UK and international aid into Gaza. The Egyptian government reportedly is opposed to the proposal due to the effect on its sovereignty. So how concerned are the British government in relation to the Israeli government's demands in respect of the Philadelphia corridor?
He will have seen, Mr Deputy Speaker, the progress that is being made on other forms of access. I've mentioned specifically the convoys from Jordan, 2 of which now have reached Gaza, and also the maritime support which Britain is making to bring Cypriot and British aid into Egypt. So we are confronting the difficulties in securing humanitarian support for those who desperately need it and doing everything we can to overcome them.
And Desi.
Thank you very much. Mr Deputy Speaker, the level of death and destruction in Gaza is horrifying and completely unacceptable, including bombings of a refugee camp on Christmas Eve, which even the Israeli government has admitted were grave errors. And that is why the likes of me have been calling for and voted for, wishing to see an end to the violence. So will the Minister agree with me and call for a humanitarian truce which can be used to secure a sustainable ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire, and an end to this conflict?
Well, I do agree with him that we are seeking humanitarian pauses and that we hope that we can reach a sustainable ceasefire. That is the policy of the government, and it is the policy that was echoed at the United Nations. But he will also want to reflect that Israel has an absolute right to self-defence, but they must do so within international humanitarian law.
Toby Perkins.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Young women
just out of school remain in captivity, facing, as we know, rape and sexual violence as a weapon of war by Hamas, and we know that Hamas remain a barrier rather than a conduit towards a two-state solution. On the other side, senior politicians and the Israeli ambassador now feel the confidence to be able to declare that a two-state solution is off the table and that they're completely ruling out the position that he is articulating there. Does he not share my fear that him refusing to condemn the comments of the Israeli ambassador and continuing to say that we support the international law when it's clear that that is being broken will give the Israelis the sense that secretly we do support this approach that they're taking? Actually, as friends of the Israelis, we must be much stronger in condemning what they are doing.
Minister.
Well, there's nothing secret engaged here. We have been very clear exactly where we stand, even when it's not very popular across the House, which is to stand up for a sustainable ceasefire, seek to get a political track and use Britain's diplomatic skills and clout, which are much respected in the region, to try and approach a political settlement that honours the two-state solution. So I'm not sure there's very much between what he and I are saying today, but that is the endeavour upon which the British government is engaged.
Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It was pleasing to hear the Minister say that Gaza must be run by Palestinians and there should be no forced resettlement of Palestinians. I'm deeply concerned by the comments made by the Israeli ambassador condemning the two-state solution. So further to the response he's given my honourable friend, I wonder if he could outline whether there is an international coalition for a two-state solution. How powerful is this international coalition? How much influence does it have over Israel? And what is Britain's role within it?
To all the difficulties, Mr Deputy Speaker, the solid refrain that there has to be a two-state solution with both Israel and Palestine living behind secure borders in peace has been a constant one. And if she reads what is said at the United Nations in the speeches that are made by many of the countries to which she was referring, I think she will draw some hope from that consistency.
Patrick Grady.
Deputy Speaker, over Christmas I heard from a constituent whose sister and her sister's 4 children are stuck in Gaza. Now, if there was a ceasefire, it might be easier for them to leave Gaza. If the UK were prepared to offer humanitarian visas to relatives of UK citizens who are in Gaza, it might be easier for them to leave. So what is his message to my constituent and her sister and her young children who are trapped in Gaza?
Well, I think it is difficult, Mr Deputy Speaker, for me to comment on a specific case, but if he wishes to discuss it with me after this urgent question, I'll be very happy to see him. He will know that 300 British nationals have been able to leave, thanks not least to the hard work of the brilliant young men and women who are working in the emergency centre at the Foreign Office in London. A small number remain, but we are working literally night and day to make sure we do everything we can to look after our citizens and their relations.
Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you. He mentioned Oslo earlier in response to my right honourable friend, the member for East Ham. The sad tragedy is that Prime Minister Netanyahu never really supported Oslo and two-state solution. Hamas definitely didn't, and the two have thrived off each other's absolutist positions over the past few decades. But for those of us that do believe in Oslo, do believe in a peace process, and do believe in two states for two peoples, what happens next really matters. Now, he said he wanted to secure better arrangements for the Palestinian Authority after the fighting ends. What does he mean by that?
Well, the Foreign Secretary has been engaged with both the Foreign Minister and President Abbas from the Palestinian Authority. Britain wants to support the Palestinian Authority in developing further the sinews of statehood that would be required if there were to be, as I hope one day there will, a two-state solution. So in the first part of his question, I very much agree with his analysis, and it is now for Britain and other countries to do everything we can to develop those abilities within the Palestinian Authority so that they can properly exercise that power and governance and representation in Gaza in due course.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you,
Deputy Speaker, in the light of Zippy Hotovelli's statement on LBC radio saying that the destruction of Gaza should continue and be extensive to the point that she did, why hasn't the government condemned those words, as it did draw back on her previous comment about a two-state solution? And what is he going to do? Because this is inconsistent with everything he is saying at the dispatch box.
Well, no one, Mr Deputy Speaker, wants to see wanton destruction. That's why I've been very clear about international humanitarian law. But also, I hope that she would assert that given the horrendous events of October the 7th, Israel does have a right to self-defence, and that is what it is seeking to exercise in tracking down and stopping the Hamas ability to repeat what it did on October the 7th, which Hamas leaders have made clear they wish to do.
Kevin Brown.
Thank you. I'm struggling to understand what the government's response is, apart from surprise to the use of extremist language. What chance can there be for the humanitarian truce that's needed now and for a sustainable ceasefire and a lasting peace when extremist views are uttered not just by terrorist organisations but by some government ministers and diplomats representing the Israeli government?
Well, there are many wild statements, Mr Deputy Speaker, that are made, some of which members across the House will agree with and others which they will not. But the purpose of the British government is to achieve a sustainable ceasefire. It is to meet the immense humanitarian need that exists, and it is then to lift people's eyes when this terrible conflict is over to the possibilities of peace that a political track can deliver.
Stuart McDonnell.
A great many of my constituents write to me on a daily basis demanding the government change its position to deliver a ceasefire. But can I ask them on this point about language? When Israeli ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir said that Gaza should be essentially free of Palestinians, the government, along with European counterparts, correctly condemned them. But when the ambassador in London calls for Gaza to be flattened even more than it already has been, they say nothing. Why?
Well, Mr Speaker, I have explained in some detail what the policy of the government is, both in respect of tackling the humanitarian need which so manifestly exists, but also in developing the political track when this conflict is over. And I very much hope that that is something which he and his party will feel able to support.
Emma Lulbach.
Very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. The UN has described Gaza as a graveyard for children. It's reported that more than 9,000 have been killed and thousands more severely injured. Those children who have survived face a bleak future with limited access to aid as bombs continue to rain down on them. Many have lost their parents and their entire families. I heard the Minister's earlier responses, but can he explain in more detail why this government supported unaccompanied children fleeing from Ukraine but can't set up similar support for those children in Gaza?
I do not think, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the two situations are analogous. But I do think that it's very important we do everything we can to help the children and the others in Gaza whom she describes, and we will continue to do exactly that.
Cat Smith.
Mr Deputy Speaker. Further to that question, we know that children are 7 times more likely than adults to be killed by blast injuries, and that 1,000 children have lost one or both legs in the last 3 months in Gaza. The scars that Gazan children are bearing from this war will be long and lasting. So does the Minister agree that to have that two-state solution, that long and lasting peace, we need to be stepping up as a part of an international community to defend Gazan children?
Well, the plight of Gazan children will weigh heavily on all decent people, on all sides of the argument that is being expressed in the House this afternoon. The government will continue to do everything it can, but in terms of the long-term point that she made in her question about the two-state solution, all our diplomatic and political efforts are bent towards trying to secure that.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. After almost 23,000 civilian deaths, including almost 10,000 children, many observers are describing the atrocity in Gaza as a genocide. I take the Minister at his word, and absolutely in his belief that we need to see a two-state solution. However, last week we heard Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, describing the need for voluntary emigration from Gaza and Israeli occupation, resettlement of Gaza, and also the Prime Minister Netanyahu and Ambassador Tovli describing what they want to see, which is the outright destruction of Hamas and the Palestinian people. I think we need to be honest. When Netanyahu calls for a total victory, he wants to see the annihilation of the Palestinian people, doesn't he?
I do not think that a close observation of his remarks would sustain that view, but the point that he's making underlines how important it is for people to be moderate in their language as we seek to move through this dreadful crisis, both in humanitarian terms and ceasefire terms, to the point beyond when there can be a political track with some hope of success.
Finally, the ever-patient Mary Kellyford.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Is the Minister aware that before Christmas a sniper murdered 2 women, a mother and a daughter, inside the Holy Family Parish in Gaza? The Latin Patriarchate of Jerusalem stated that the women were shot in cold blood inside the premises of the parish where there are no belligerents. Pope Francis has condemned the attack, as has the Archbishop of Westminster. Will the government?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, we are not clear about the full facts of what happened. We have, of course, heard what the Holy Father said and what others have said as well. But the fact that any innocent person loses their lives in this horrendous circumstances is something which the whole House will deplore.
Order. I thank the Minister of State for taking so many questions and the Shadow Foreign Secretary for staying the course. That concludes the urgent question. So if members wishing to do so would now like to leave the chamber as swiftly and as quietly as possible,